But what really became interesting and more apparent is in this particular forecast was that, yes, I mean, the strongest growth for Facebook and also for social networks in general, because Facebook is such a large part of that, is among that older generation.
Hey gang, it's Monday, June 21st. Was that Monday? I half guessed what the date was going to be Is that what it is? Monday is, okay, Victoria's given the nod. It's the 21st. We've got confirmation. Debbie and listeners, welcome to the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by VTEX. I know what you're thinking, Marcus, if you don't know the date, how's the rest of the episode going to go? I'm not quite sure. We'll see. I'm Marcus, as I might have already mentioned. This is going very bad. I'm joined today by our principal analyst who covers everything social media. It's Deborah Aho Williamson.
Hey, Marcus. And of
Hello
course
there.
The episode's going to go great. What are you talking about?
Thank you. I needed that.
It always does.
We're off to a flying start.
Don't be so hard on yourself.
You're too kind. Today's fact, Debbie. Mike Nesmith of American rock, I think I'm saying his last name a bit wrong, of American rock band The Monkees, a significant cultural figure, but his mother should be more so. At least in my opinion. Betty Nesmith was working as an executive secretary at a bank in 1951. She began using white tempera paint to cover up typing mistakes. After perfecting the formula, you might see where this is going now. After perfecting the formula, she named it liquid paper. She offered to sell her invention to IBM, but they passed. So she began marketing it herself. It wasn't until the mid-1960s that she started making substantial money from it. Then, when she sold the rights to the Gillette Corporation in 1979, she received a $48 million paycheck plus royalties on future sales of what products am I talking about?
Whiteout.
Exactly. Whiteout, quick dry correction fluid, invented by one of the mothers of one of the Monkees.
I had no idea.
Crazy.
And that's
Thank you.
Honestly, this is the first time I've even thought about whiteout in probably about 20, 30 years.
I know a lot of young people, those are young people listening to this podcast. We love you. Thanks for being here. But you might not even know what it is. We used to, before computers and smartphones, we used to have to write things down by hand. And when you messed up, you could either cross it out, or if you're feeling fancy, you had this little kind of roll. It was like a mouse-sized roller, and you put a line of white stuff. Basically, you just painted over the mistake, which was very obvious because there was just paint all over the page. But it made you feel better about making constant mistakes. Thank you, Betty. You helped a lot of people out. So did your son. You've done great things. Today's real topic, how the slightly smaller social players are getting on. The phrase post-pandemic doesn't really mean a whole lot, especially in a world where the coronavirus is still very much affecting millions of folks, even in relatively well-vaccinated populations like the US. I guess a post-pandemic world could exist when the World Health Organization declares the COVID-19 pandemic over. Until then, it's become more painstakingly obvious that we'll be living in a with COVID world for at least a short while. So Debbie, in that world, what would you expect to see from social network user growth patterns in the next 12 to 18 months?
Yeah, you really put it great. Because when we first started talking about this research that we're going to talk about in this podcast, I did in my mind have a title, post-pandemic social usage in 2021. And it became very clear, as you said, that we can't quite use that phrase yet. But that said, we do still think that the usage patterns for social media in the US as a whole, the number of users is at this point in what we would call a post-pandemic state. What we mean by that is that last year, 2020, which was, 9 months of the year was the pandemic, we did see a very dramatic impact on social usage. We estimate that the number of monthly social network users in the US rose by 7.6 million last year, amounting to about 3.7% growth, which was much higher than we had expected before the pandemic and higher than in 2019. And that was because people were staying at home and they suddenly needed connection. We've talked about this a lot before. I don't think anybody who listens to this podcast will, consider that new news. But, now in 2021, that growth really is going back to pre-pandemic patterns. And so I guess it's post-pandemic, but with pre-pandemic patterns. And I'm starting to sound like I'm going to make a tongue twister if I say that word too many times. But essentially what we're seeing now is just a 1.6% growth in users this year. Just about 3.4 million new people coming on to social media in 2021. And from there on through the end of our forecast, growth rate's about the same. So it was really a blip caused by this heightened atmosphere of the pandemic being, top of mind for everybody and wanting to talk about it. And now we're kind of all, unfortunately, just used to it. And then we're hoping by the end of this year that people will be out and about and back to normal and, back to their also more normal social usage patterns.
You make an excellent point in your recent report. You were covering social media usage. It's called Social Media Usage 2021, just came out a few weeks ago. You know that some users weren't new. They're just returning, or lapsed users, as you put it. Cindy Liu, who's on our forecasting team, she was saying that she stopped using Facebook, but she moved outside of the city and she wanted to join groups to meet folks, Facebook groups, obviously. And so she started becoming a user again. And so by the definition of once a month, or maybe by the definition of once a day, people don't have to be brand new to the platform. It's did you come back for one reason or another? You also make the point of there's more going on here when you zoom in by age. Fascinated to see that you're saying that there's much more, it seems like, going on in social network land, total numbers in the older age group than the younger ones.
Absolutely. I mean, that was one of the interesting findings when our forecasters built the newest forecast. I mean, we already knew that young people were leaving, platforms like Facebook in the teen and young adult demographic. But what really became interesting and more apparent is in this particular forecast was that, yes, I mean, the strongest growth for Facebook and also for social networks in general, because Facebook is such a large part of that, is among that older generation, the 55 to 64 group and even older than that. And so, I mean, it's just another, confirmation that, yes, the population is for sure aging. Yeah, you point out over 65-year-olds, they will add the most users, the total of 26 million in the US. There'll be more of users in that group for the first time than the group just below them, younger than them, 55 to 64, 25 million versus the 26 in that 65 plus group. And then you say in 2 years' time, 2023, there'll be more users age 65 and older than there will be college age social network users. 28.2 million to 28 million. So it's very close, but more of those over 65-year-olds using social media than the college age 18 to 24-year-olds. Debbie, you recently, as I mentioned, wrote this Social Media Usage 2021 report, and you say that after a 2020 rebound, Twitter will experience a case of post-election malaise. On the one hand, that makes the most sense, since Twitter is incredibly news-dependent platform, news-driven platform. On the other hand, Twitter is making a surprising number of developments to its offering. Topics have been doing very well. You have super follows happening, Twitter Spaces, Twitter Blue. What do you expect to see from Twitter during the rest of 2021 with all that taken into consideration? Yeah, it is true. I mean, Twitter is very reliant on news, people who discuss news, and people who make news. That's the main type of person who uses Twitter. And 2020 was a year that we there was a lot of news. We all know
Too
that.
much news.
In many ways. And Twitter benefited very handily. The growth was about 4% last year in monthly users. But I don't think even though Twitter's adding new features, you name some of them, I would put social audio like Fleets in that as well. Topic pages, which you mentioned, those things are really, I think, more apt to keep users who are already there engaged. I don't know that necessarily people are going to go, oh, wow, Twitter has Fleets. I'm going to join Twitter. Or, oh, wow, Twitter has topic pages. That's suddenly going to draw me in. I mean, it might. But our feeling is just that, the pandemic aftermath, which is, as we've already discussed, is seeing slower growth in users in general, combined with the lack of this contentious news cycle, perhaps, fingers crossed, less news about the pandemic over the course of the year. We're expecting the number of Twitter users will actually fall, we'll be about flat this year, and then next year start a fall just slightly to 55.3 million with a few more drops coming through the end of our forecast. So that's really where Twitter's at. I mean, it's still a very popular platform, very powerful, but the gains it saw last year will not be repeated in the succeeding years.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you said that's where Twitter's at, and if we project into the future, as you said, looking at where Twitter's going to end up, you know in the report that they're going to end up a little bit higher than what we expected pre-pandemic. However, what's happened is they got the bump and then they're going to start to tick down. Without the pandemic, we didn't expect them to reach the level that they're going to, given our most recent update to the forecast. And it's also with Twitter, I guess like a lot of other platforms, but particularly Twitter, it's a story of domestic versus international growth. Twitter added nearly 30 million new monthly active users worldwide in 2020, according to us. That's versus the 2 million they added in the US. Worldwide, they'll add another 10 million more this year, another 7 million more the year after that. So doing very well internationally, but the US has slowed down a lot, flat to ticking down a tiny bit. Debbie, you write that Reddit is turning on its growth engine. How so?
So Reddit's really an interesting one. And, full disclosure, I've been an analyst covering social media for a very long time. Reddit is a platform that, again, full disclosure, I really haven't spent a whole lot of time thinking about over the past few years. There were other platforms that were far more interesting to write about, to think about. The user base was certainly larger for some of the platforms, or growing more substantially. But Reddit has had a really interesting turnaround. And we saw it grew pretty substantially last year around the world. It's received new funding, which is helping it to also boost growth. There was the whole Wall Street Bets subreddit, which small investors flocked to earlier in the year, which really drew Reddit into the mainstream in terms of news coverage. And now we see Reddit with a lot of momentum, and we expect that Reddit will be the second fastest growing social network in the U.S. this year, increasing its user base. Just behind TikTok, by the way. So TikTok first. And this is how it was last year as well. So in 2020, TikTok and Reddit were number 1 and number 2. And in 2021, again, TikTok and Reddit number 1 and number 2 fastest growing. Obviously, from smaller base, we're expecting Reddit to grow 14.4% this year to a logged in user base of 43.3 million. So much smaller than any of the other platforms that we talk about, except, interestingly, Twitter. We actually think that with the growth that Reddit is having, and it will be sustained through the next few years, by the end of our forecast in 2025, Reddit will be within shouting distance of Twitter, with only about 2 million users less than Twitter.
Wow.
So that's why I'm paying more attention to Reddit.
Yes, because it starts to get close to, and then therefore be in the conversation with some of those other larger players. 55 million for Twitter, 53 million logged in users for Reddit. When projecting out, that's by 2025, you said, right?
Yes. Yep. By 2025. So just to recap, but we're expecting 53 million logged in Reddit users in 2025 compared to 54.8 million Twitter users. In the US.
Remarkable.
Yeah.
You point out as well, 55% of Reddit's US users are aged 25 to 44 as well. It's a very interesting demographic. Let's move to 2 other companies, Debbie, quickly before we wrap up the lead. You note that LinkedIn and Pinterest pivoted during the pandemic, finding new ways to grow. We'll take them in turn. LinkedIn first. What was their pivot?
So for LinkedIn, it was this move to virtual work, combined with the reality that there was a lot of downsizing as well in the working population. So that led more people to use LinkedIn for networking, for career advice, for connecting with other people, commiserating, job hunting, all of those things. And LinkedIn really did a nice job of pivoting to make LinkedIn more indispensable. So for years, people kind of considered LinkedIn as like their Rolodex, where you go only if you really want to reach out to somebody. But I know for me, this was my own personal experience, and many others I've talked to have said the same thing, that they are now very regular visitors. I go to LinkedIn every day now, and I never did that before the pandemic.
Why is that? Why are you going every day
They
now?
do a very good job of notifications, not only when you've been mentioned, but when people in your circle have posted something interesting. The feed has gotten a lot more interesting. There's just more comments. There's more, more engagement. Whatever it is, and I don't know if it's the combination of the pandemic or just LinkedIn being more smart about promoting that engagement, it's really made the platform a lot more essential for professionals than I think it ever has been.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
We're estimating that LinkedIn gained 3.6 million users last year to about 62 million. And it's we're forecasting it to grow another 2.6 million users this year to close to 65 million. So just want to make sure I threw that in.
And so Pinterest, what was their pivot?
So previous to the pandemic, many people used Pinterest to plan events, a wedding, the birth of a baby, a trip, things like that. Stuff like that obviously didn't really happen much during the pandemic. So Pinterest had to start promoting itself for other reasons. So things like cooking, crafting, home remodeling. Pinterest really did a nice job of making that sort of content more visible and promoting it and getting people to realize that, yes, Pinterest was still useful for these sort of everyday home-based activities and not just for the big one-time events. That was kind of a criticism of Pinterest early on, was that people would use it very heavily when they were planning something like their wedding. And then after that happened, then maybe they wouldn't use it as often. So it became, in the process, a much more used platform on a daily or monthly basis. And so that helped it to grow to end last year with about 88 million monthly users, up about 6.5 million over last year. So again, nice pivots from both LinkedIn and Pinterest to spur growth during a tough time.
Yeah, indeed. That's it for the first half. Time now for the halftime report, where we summarize the key takeaways from a lead story in about 30 seconds or less. Debbie, your key takeaways from the first half?
So my key takeaways are that overall social network usage is growing much more slowly this year than last year. But the smaller properties, which are, yes, coming from a smaller base, are some very interesting stories. I mean, from LinkedIn to Reddit to Pinterest and even Twitter. There's different types of growth happening and different populations for most of them. And with the exception of Twitter, which we discussed, they've all really weathered the pandemic very well and have had some smart growth in the past year, and that we expect will continue.
Well, the full report's called US Social Media Usage 2021. Facebook is stalling, TikTok is challenging Instagram, and other key trends. And if you're thinking to yourself, why the hell didn't you talk about them? We did already. May 18th episode with Peter Newman and Oscar Roscoe on our forecasting team. So check that episode out. That's all we've got time for the first half. It's time now for In Other News, but first a quick word from our sponsor, VTEX. Retail's next competitive threat may come from a business model or channel that didn't even exist a few months ago. This modern dynamic requires companies to adapt quickly, pivoting business seemingly overnight, something traditional commerce platforms just can't support. There's a new enterprise commerce platform on the rise, one that's fast, flexible, and doesn't require 9 months and $1 million to get up and running. Go to vtex.com/emarketer to learn more. All right, folks, we are back today. In other news, what is neighborhood social network Nextdoor's ceiling? The government rescinds an executive order to ban TikTok. And what are the implications of young creators burning out? Story 1. Neighborhood social network Nextdoor has witnessed significant growth over the last 2 years, with daily active users up 50% in 2020 year on year, notes Kim Hart of Axios. She notes a lot of Nextdoor's growth was fueled by folks looking for local information about COVID-19, school closures and vaccinations. But something changed for Nextdoor. A platform that was used like a local bulletin board became a microcosm of national tensions, she writes, following the social justice protests of last summer. But there are still a number of helpful use cases for Nextdoor, notes Miss Hart. Neighbors can report incidents, mayors can post direct messages. Debbie, as someone who covers social, but also as someone who's used Nextdoor, can Nextdoor change its image back to how it started? And if so, what's its ceiling?
Yeah, I think that's a really tough one. First of all, we don't yet forecast Nextdoor, so I don't have any numbers to share of our own. However, I mean, I fully do believe that Nextdoor saw a renaissance during the pandemic for all the reasons that you discussed and that we also discussed earlier in the podcast. It is a tough one because I think it is a microcosm of tensions. I see that on the Nextdoor that in my own community, but I also, that hasn't stopped me from using it. So, because there's all sorts of fun stuff too, whether it's just a lost pet that's been found or somebody trying to help a neighbor who needs something. I mean, there's all sorts of wonderful things that happen there. So, I think it's really up to Nextdoor to figure out how to, if it can, to moderate the content, to make it, an atmosphere that people want to engage in. And that's, I think, where it needs to go in order to continue growing like it has.
There's definitely more of an appetite for local. Nextdoor needs to find ways to sustain engagement as people venture further afield as the pandemic ease is, Ms. Hart notes that they are expanding the number of neighborhoods a user can belong to and encouraging participation from local businesses, schools, nonprofits, and government agencies. I think that's quite cool. It'd be nice to belong to maybe a couple of neighborhoods just around your neighborhood. It would be nice to be able to belong to my parents' neighborhood back home and also the one where I now live, so I can have a sense of what's going on back home, but also what's going on here across the pond. Story 2. Last year, President Trump attempted to stop TikTok from being downloaded in the US and was telling TikTok's parent company ByteDance that it had to sell its US stake in the app. Why? Concerns over how Americans' personal data might be used by foreign entities. Now, the Biden administration has rescinded the executive order to ban Chinese-owned app, TikTok, and also WeChat. Instead, the government instated a mandate to review any foreign-owned apps that could pose a national security risk. Debbie, what does this mean for TikTok's user growth, if anything?
Well, I mean, I think that it takes a lot of the pressure, or all, pretty much all the pressure right now off of TikTok. And so, users didn't really ever stop using TikTok during all of this. If anything, more people flocked to start using it because they thought it was going to be taken away or they wouldn't be able to download it. So it actually ended up causing a bump in usage, which probably ended up helping TikTok get even bigger than it already has grown. And as far as the ban, I mean, I feel like we never really thought that the ban would happen. And I'm glad to hear that at this point, it's true that it didn't happen and that, Biden is taking a more measured approach. The pressure's not completely off of TikTok, and certainly marketers need to be aware that there could still be challenges ahead as Biden, looks into, foreign companies and their use of data. But for now, I think it's, full steam ahead for users to continue using TikTok and for advertisers to continue working there as well.
Couple of TikTok numbers. We estimate TikTok will record 79 million users in the US this year, with growth slowing to single digits. In the coming years, 36% of social network users will be using TikTok today. 40% will be in 2 years' time. Interestingly, huge differences by demographic as by age, as I'm sure you would imagine. 9 out of 10 social network using teenagers use TikTok versus 1 in 10 over 45-year-olds who use a social network. Story 3. The last year has been tough on pretty much everyone. Parents working from home, healthcare workers never going home, service workers losing jobs and braving the front lines. Another group has also struggled mightily. Young creators burning out and breaking down, writes Taylor Lorenz of the New York Times. She notes that young Gen Z creators are struggling with the challenge of building, managing and monetizing a following. TikTok's biggest star, Charli D'Amelio, over 117 million followers, recently said that she had lost the passion for posting content, as well as some other use cases in here talking about people struggling with depression, etc. Debbie, your thoughts on the issue? And also, is there a brand safety concern here being associated with contributing to creator/young person burnout?
Yeah, this is a really tough one because, I mean, the cynic in me probably is thinking that there's probably a lot of, ha-haing going on right now about, those poor creators, who are experiencing burnout. And I think there is some truth to that, right? I mean, they chose this job and it is a grueling job creating content, but at the same time, they chose to create fun videos or to post images of themselves. And I think that there's a certain kind of feeling of, well, you chose this. And if you're feeling burnout, then sorry, that's the impression I get.
Comes with the territory.
I mean, I think from the platform's perspective, this is why, bringing it back to business, I mean, I think this is why all the social platforms are developing some new monetization tools. So like tips, gifts, subscriptions, giving creators more tools they can work with to make money, to feel like they are empowered, and to feel like they have ownership over their stuff, their content. So these are all good things. I mean, but I do think, though, that the creators, I mean, it is hard work. It is hard work. It's not all fun and silly videos. But at the same time, it's hard to really feel too sorry for creators because they did choose this as their job.
Yes, especially when you zoom out and you take into consideration how many people have been struggling. It is hard to have a tremendous amount of sympathy. However, as someone who helps to create a daily podcast, I can definitely sympathize with the idea of having to create something every single day. And this is one podcast, it's a lot of work, but having to create multiple videos every single day must be exhausting. And I guess a lot of this is the fact that these people are so young. so teenagers or early 20-somethings, and that's a real concern, I think, because it's just you've still got so much to figure out when you're that age.
Yeah. I know, honestly, one other thing I forgot to mention too is, and I think this is a relevant point, in social media, your successes and your failures are completely public. I mean, in the forms of likes and comments and things like that. I mean, unlike other jobs where, if you had a bad day, maybe not that many people knew about it. In social media, if you had a bad video and no one liked it, they're going to let you know about it. So there's that as well.
Great point. Signal Fire says that apparently 50 million people consider themselves creators. Lots of folks. That's what we've got time for this episode. Thank you so much to Debbie for joining me.
Thank you, Marcus.
Of course, thank you to Victoria. She edits the show. Thanks to everyone listening. We'll see you guys tomorrow, hopefully, for the Behind the Numbers Daily, the Marketer podcast made possible by VTEX.